When looking back on my teen romantic comedy SNAFU, my enjoyment for the show all comes down to Hikigaya Hachiman, the cynical and unsociable high school student that would denounce anyone enjoying even the slightest bit of their youth. From experiencing years of bullying, isolation, rejection, and more, Hachiman built walls around himself, forbidding anyone from getting close to him. He prefers to be alone, yet he's surprisingly introspective and socially aware. His understanding of social dynamics and discerning one's true intentions is second to none. Yet it's because of these exact things that he pushes people away. Deep down, Hachiman always yearned for social interaction and wanted to feel like he belonged somewhere. Evidenced by being forced into the service club and meeting Yui and Yukino, he realized not only that people truly cared for him, but that he could truly care for them as well. But despite knowing this, his traumatic past conditioned him to live in constant fear that someone wants to hurt him, preventing himself from obtaining what he wants most: to have something genuine. So, in today's video essay, we're going to be exploring the inner workings of Hikigaya Hachiman. What about his surroundings made him want to become a cynical and unsociable loner? What cognitive processes was he experiencing that prevented him from opening up to others? In the end, what exactly changed Hachiman? Hello everyone, my name is Intuition, and this is my teen romantic comedy SNAFU, How Society Breaks Us Down.
Yahallo! 動物は基本群れるものである。肉食獣にはヒエラルキーがあり、ボスになれなければ死ぬまでストレスを抱え続ける。
Let's begin with the concept of social hierarchies, where this article by Koski, Shia, and Olson defines it as the ranking of members in social groups based on the power, influence, or dominance they exhibit, whereby some members are superior or subordinate to others. This is a good place to start because, as you might expect, social hierarchies are highly prevalent in high school. This is a place where adolescents are constantly comparing themselves to others in regards to athletics, intelligence, looks, popularity, and more. Thus, it's obvious that some people will be looking to see who is better or worse in these aspects and then arbitrarily decide where they belong in the hierarchy. As you can imagine, Hachiman stands at the bottom. Nonetheless, we see how social hierarchies cause a negative impact on Hachiman's daily life. This mainly comes about from those at the top of the social hierarchy acting as though they get free reign over everything and everyone. One example comes early on when Yumiko's group tries to take away the tennis court from the service club. Rather than being understanding of Hachiman's situation or simply deciding not to play tennis because others are using it, Yumiko acts aggressive and Hayama tries to be cooperative, all in order to obtain what they want. Funnily enough, Hachiman literally points this out to them.
Hayama, お前の優しさは嬉しい。性格がいいのもよくわかった。サッカー部のエースで、その上お顔までよろしいじゃないですか。さぞや女性に表になられるんでしょうな。いきなりなんだよ。そんないろいろと持ってるお前が、何も持ってない俺からテニスコートまで奪う気なの？
An even better example comes with Sagami, who volunteered to be the cultural festival committee chairwoman, but for selfish reasons. We see how her behavior leads to more work being given onto Hachiman and others, leading to some developing fatigue and sickness. But Sagami gets a pass because she took on the highest position within the committee, yet not doing any of the work. And once again, Hachiman is able to explain her abuse of power super well.
あんな風に誰かに認められて、求められて、頼りにされるような人間に。だからインスタントに委員長という肩書きを貼り付けた。逆に誰かにレッテルを貼って、見下すことで自分の優位性を確認したかった。それがお前の言う成長の正体だ。
Despite the inherent unfairness that can come along with social hierarchies, they are a natural part of life. They tend to form quickly and spontaneously, often according to the needs of the entire group. Because of this, Hachiman's only choices are to deal with the social hierarchy or to become a loner. But with the examples given earlier, by choosing the former option while standing at the bottom of the hierarchy, this would entail those at the top treating him unfairly or looking down on him, all because of this supposed and forced power difference. This is why, in Hachiman's own words, he says,
熊になりたい。
にゃー、にゃー。
The way we move up or down the social hierarchy can be explained in this article by Paul Gilbert, where he suggests the idea that humans compete to be seen as attractive in order to gain resources such as approval, care, and support from others. It's in our nature to interact with others and want to feel as though we belong, but humans are also picky about who they choose to surround themselves with. We want to be with people that are similar or useful to our interests or values, which is opposed to befriending those who don't share interests or values, seem likely to let us down, give off bad vibes, and other various reasons. Because of this, as Paul Gilbert states, thus, we have to compete in social arenas to prove our worth to others, in order to engage them in helpful roles. Whenever we gain a glimpse into Hachiman's past, some of them involve him trying to prove his worth to others. He tries to make conversation, he tries to get that girl's number, he tries to text people, but all of them result in failure. His every effort to socialize and belong somewhere were met with disgust. And now we can see how Hachiman absolutely despises this idea of having to prove yourself. Doing so would require changing yourself in a way that conforms to other people's standards or ideals. But this also means becoming the very person that would harshly reject his younger self.
自分は変えられるなんてのはそのゴミみたいな冷淡で残酷な世界に順応して負けを認めて隷属する行為だ。綺麗な言葉で飾って自分すら騙している欺瞞に過ぎない。
With that said though, especially during a time such as high school where you see the same people nearly every day and much of your time in the day is spent there, all of a sudden, it can become quite important to prove your worth. After all, it's not uncommon for adolescents to perceive their high school years as some kind of long journey and to want to make the most out of it. Even Hachiman was in that same boat.
新しい生活にワクワクしてしまったあまり、1時間も早く家を出たら。
On the contrary, high school can also be a time where you're left out and or ostracized by everyone. Especially given the way that school is set up, opportunities for this can occur quite easily. Groups of people may gang up on one person, getting excluded from hangouts, gossip or rumors, and the list goes on. And no matter the reason or how tough you believe yourself to be, experiences like this will hurt. Therefore, with how we are evaluated and treated in everyday life being a significant aspect, it becomes quite clear how proving your worth can be important. But given that Hachiman has been trying for most of his life, only to be met with failure after failure, all he could do was give up and decide to become a loner. Fundamentally, the way we make ourselves attractive to others is all about impressions. Paul Gilbert's article discusses a concept called impression management, where we adjust how we present ourselves to have an influence over how others think about us. If we want to feel included and valued by others, then the way we act, behave, and appear has to be similar with the interests or values of them as well. This can come in the form of wearing clothes that are in to appear cool, or using hand gestures and fancy jargon to appear intelligent. The best example of this would be Ishiki Iroha, who knows exactly what she wants from others, so she'll adjust the way she acts and behaves to influence how others perceive her. Essentially, we adjust our self-presentation to reach the desired impression on others, which in turn will help us to obtain what we want. When connecting this concept back to Hachiman, he has definitely failed multiple times in achieving his desired impression. With the goal of making friends or having a romantic relationship, Hachiman would try to act and present himself in a way that would help him achieve that. However, more often than not, the impression he makes on people ends up being the opposite. An excellent example of this is when Hachiman tries asking for a girl's number, but ends up putting on a creepy smile that makes the girl uncomfortable. Then, after many similar failed attempts, Hachiman eventually learned that no one wanted to be associated with him, let alone be his friend or romantic partner. The buildup of these negative experiences has not only influenced the way in which he interacts with people, but also how he has come to view the world at large. Just as this article by Mark Leary and Katrina Jongman-Sereno quotes, this is what Hachiman ultimately learned from his experiences. People devalue and reject one another primarily on the basis of the impressions that they have formed. Whether accurate or inaccurate, certain impressions lead us to like, value, and accept another person, whereas other impressions lead to disliking, devaluation, and rejection. Most of Hachiman's attempts to socialize end with him being perceived as a creep or ill-hearted. All he wanted to do was make friends and enjoy his youth, but instead, he slowly lost faith in others. Their constant misjudgments only brought him further away from his innocent goal, and eventually, he simply had to accept that being a loner would be a much less hurtful experience. The only thing Hachiman could do was give up.
この子はもう見限ったのだ。自分が変われば世界が変わると言うが、そんなことはない。人が人を評価するのは固定観念と印象だ。ぼっちはぼっちであることを強要される。何かを頑張って目立てば。
To explain from a different perspective and how impressions can affect people, Hachiman has experienced the harsh feeling of betrayal from misinterpreting someone else's impression. Impressions are also the fundamental concept behind Hachiman's famous "I hate nice girls" speech. As a teenager excited to experience a rose-colored youth, he couldn't help but find special meaning in coincidences or random events that seemed to approve his efforts. In reality, the other person would put on a facade that displayed friendliness and kindness. Hachiman would develop hopeful expectations from their actions and behavior, and then be crushed soon after simply because he fell for their impression. Hachiman understands he was naive back then, but now, the accumulation of these experiences taught him to never fall for that same mistake ever again.
いつだって期待して、いつも勘違いして、いつからか希望を持つのはやめた。訓練されたぼっちは二度も同じ手に引っかかったりしない。百戦錬磨の強者、負けることに関しては俺が最強。だから、いつまでも優しい女の子は嫌いだ。やめて、仲良くして。
君は面白いね。いつもそうやって言葉や行動の裏を読もうとする。そういうの私結構好きだよ。悪意に怯えてるみたいで可愛いもの。
All of these social dynamics have hurt Hachiman in many different ways. After having his genuine self constantly rejected by everyone, the only solution was to become closed off and to not take part in such a cruel and hostile world. If anything, rather than dealing with the idea that the world rejected him, then Hachiman just has to believe that he rejected the world. This is basically what we call a defense mechanism. These are psychological strategies that we unconsciously use to reduce the anxiety or guilt that arises from unacceptable or unwanted thoughts or feelings. In Hachiman's case, he most likely wants to avoid the friendly and sociable desires he once had. He doesn't want to encounter the person that wanted to get along with others, the person that once had an innocent and kind heart. Thus, Hachiman uses defense mechanisms to prevent himself from having these kinds of thoughts, which in turn will prevent him from getting hurt once again and giving birth to the infamous cynical and unsociable loner that we all know and love. Defense mechanisms may or may not result in healthy consequences for us. It all depends on the circumstances and frequency with which they're used. However, in Hachiman's case, his defense mechanisms become unequivocally significant when he meets Yui and Yukino, the first two people in his life that he truly cares about. He wants to remain connected with these two, but this becomes much harder as his defense mechanisms inadvertently cause strain to his relationship with them. To exemplify this, let's take a look at one of the major turning points in the story, the Kyoto school trip arc. We can identify and analyze a few important defense mechanisms that Hachiman uses, and see how it causes problems to his relationship with Yui and Yukino. The first mechanism we'll begin with is altruism, the virtuous trait of caring and acting for the happiness and well-being of others. Although one wouldn't view altruism as a defense mechanism at first glance, most definitely, one's altruism can become distorted and take on a more unhealthy form. In the psychological literature, this is called pathological altruism, a person who sincerely engages in what he or she intends to be altruistic acts, but who harms the very person or group he or she is trying to help, often in unanticipated fashion, or harms others, or irrationally becomes a victim of his or her own altruistic actions. And for our case, we'll be specifically focusing on that last segment. Most definitely, Hachiman is an altruistic person. He helps people when they're in trouble, no matter who it is, and goes to great lengths to do so. He doesn't believe this about himself, but other people definitely see this trait within him. Moreover, Hachiman has the advantage of being able to figure out the root cause of someone's problem. With the Kyoto school trip arc, he was the only one to understand what Ebina's request was.
でも理解してたでしょ？
男子同士を仲良くというのは自分から男子を遠ざけてほしい、ひいては戸辺の告白を未然に防いでほしいということだ。
Even so, Hachiman's altruistic acts tend to have detrimental effects on himself. To prevent Tobe's confession, Hachiman believed the solution was to fake his own confession to Ebina. However, what this entails is a willingness to make an embarrassment out of himself, to steal away Tobe's genuine confession, and to accept Ebina's fake rejection in front of everyone. In other words, Hachiman was wholly committed to being the sacrifice, all for the sake of helping out people that he doesn't necessarily care for. Although Hachiman's cynical and loner beliefs should lead him to not taking part in altruistic acts, because his altruism tends to be self-sacrificial, this actually leads to his cynical and loner beliefs being reinforced. Hachiman is a deeply hurt person, given that society has outright rejected him. Thus, his cynical and loner self is what has protected him all this time, protecting him from the negative emotions, feelings, and thoughts that came from his past failures. Therefore, through undertaking these forms of self-sacrifice, this reinforces the idea that others will use him for their own self-gain. As they reap all the benefits, they also disregard the hurt and pain they put Hachiman through, thereby proving his cynical and loner beliefs to be correct. And sadly enough, Hayama was entirely aware of this, but allowed it to happen anyway.
君はそういうやり方しか知らないんだと分かっていたのに。すまない。
謝るんじゃねえよ。
Because this mindset and way of life is so deep-rooted into his personality, Hachiman is unable to acknowledge how his behavior hurts Yui and Yukino. He doesn't want to believe that getting himself hurt, especially for others' sake, is something that hurts them as well. More so, he doesn't want to recognize how avoiding his own hurt and pain is also a problem for them. Hachiman is smart and caring, but since he's been alone for most of his life, his methods don't account for the feelings of people that care about him. And because of it, the sacrificial altruism is becoming at odds with what's most important to him. This takes us to our next defense mechanism of rationalization, or the justification of unacceptable behaviors to make them tolerable to oneself. Although the specific behavior is unacceptable to them, sometimes these acts come about from an unconscious instinctual impulse. In the aftermath, one has to find logical excuses and reasons to avoid the unpleasant emotions associated with committing such undesirable behavior. In Hachiman's case, what's most interesting about his use of rationalization is what exactly he's trying to justify. For starters, he doesn't necessarily find self-sacrificing to be unacceptable, especially given that he sacrificed himself before in his confrontation with Sagami. However, what gives us a clue is when Hachiman starts rationalizing, which is right after Yui brings up her worries.
こういうのもうなしね。
あれが一番効率が良かった。それだけだ。
効率とかそういうことじゃ。
Hachiman starts making his excuses and reasons because he wants to avoid the guilt from knowing his actions inadvertently hurt Yui and Yukino, especially when all he wanted to do was help them. He never wanted to see Yui and Yukino in this emotional state, but since Hachiman has never had any close relationships before, nor is he used to having others care for him like this, he doesn't exactly know how to approach this issue or how he even truly feels for this matter. Simply put, the only thing Hachiman knows is that he's not only deceiving others with his words, but that he's deceiving himself as well. The last defense mechanism we'll be discussing is avoidance, which is dismissing thoughts or feelings that are uncomfortable or keeping away from people, places, or situations associated with uncomfortable thoughts or feelings. This is the unwillingness to remain in contact with negative events, which leads to the short-term relief of discomfort. In doing so, there's an increased likelihood that the avoidance behavior will persist and cause harm in the long term. Overall, avoidance can negatively impact important and valued aspects of one's life. After the Kyoto school trip, Hachiman's relationship with Yui and Yukino has become strained. It's clear that Hachiman is experiencing a lot of uncomfortable emotions related to his current situation. He doesn't take much notice of Yui during class, he buys a different brand of coffee than usual, he's engaged in deep contemplation, etc. As a result, Hachiman spends time avoiding his conflict with Yui and Yukino by coming to the club room much later, needing full courage as he stands before the door. The avoidance continues when Hachiman simply doesn't say anything and acts like everything is normal. The surprise to see him come to the club room and the awkward silence after he sits down are all signs that something is wrong, but Hachiman chooses to ignore it. As Yui tries to make conversation about Hayama's group, which seems to be awfully similar to how the trio is acting, Hachiman's final thought on the topic is that acting like nothing happened is simply much better, or essentially, avoidance.
まあ、あんまり気にしてもあれだ。俺たちも普通にしてやるのが一番じゃねえの。
Deep down, Hachiman knows they're unhappy with him, yet he remains unwilling to communicate. And well, there's several reasons as to why this could be. It could be that Hachiman doesn't want to resolve their issues because this requires communicating your feelings, and he wants to avoid the possibility that Yui and or Yukino won't truly understand him. Maybe Hachiman's afraid that these problems will cause them to fall apart, and if that happens, then this means the trio weren't as genuine with each other as previously thought. I believe it's a mix of both. Hachiman is definitely afraid the trio is not truly being genuine with each other, but he's also afraid to confront that very feeling. Even though Hachiman proclaims how his veteran loner status means nothing or nobody will ever hurt him, he's come to accept Yui and Yukino as the only people that would genuinely accept him and be his friend. Given that this is what he's always wanted, Hachiman is simply afraid of the possibility of losing them. Yet, he's unable to mend his relationship with them because of the mixed feelings he's inexperienced with.
なんかあった？
なんもねえよ。むしろあれだな、逆に俺の人生なんもなさすぎるまである。
Hachiman has developed all these precious moments and experiences with Yui and Yukino, but because of that, then the more Hachiman has to lose. Thus, his use of defense mechanisms is a way for him to avoid confronting these uncomfortable feelings and or thoughts, in the hope that things can just continue the way they always have been. All these defense mechanisms we've talked about so far are only those contained within and a bit beyond the Kyoto school trip arc. Not only are there more examples of Hachiman committing these defense mechanisms throughout all 3 seasons, but there's also other defense mechanisms that he commits. Regardless, although these defense mechanisms are ones that Hachiman has used to protect himself from getting hurt, sadly, it also hurts him by threatening what he came to truly care about the most, Yui and Yukino. Adolescence is a time where teenagers are scrambling around to develop an identity. During this time, we ask ourselves questions like, who am I? Or who do I want to be? While experimenting with different appearances and behaviors to find our own unique identity that truly resonates with us. This is a developmental process called identity formation, but for Hachiman, it seems like he was already done with that process. To put simply, the identity he settled with was that of a cynical and unsociable loner. As we already know, this all begins to change when he joins the service club. With every moment they share together, Hachiman's identity changes little by little. But when the trio starts having problems with each other, how Hachiman views and understands himself becomes a bit more complicated.
単純にカッコつけてるだけなのだと思う。己の中に定めたあるべき姿を裏切るまいと意固地になっているに過ぎない。再三問うのだ。それは本当に正しいのかと。
When viewing this from Higgins' self-discrepancy theory, the cynical and unsociable loner was Hachiman's ideal self, or our understanding of what attributes that we would like, ideally, to possess, i.e., one's hopes, aspirations, or wishes for themselves. In his mind, he believed a perfect life was to be alone and to despise socializing, friendships, and relationships. He wanted to see that people truly did have malicious intentions and would try to harm you when they could. Don't believe in kindness, don't trust others, and don't be vulnerable with anyone. Hachiman would make sure his actions and behaviors represented that, but now Hachiman isn't so sure anymore. What Hachiman is struggling with is his ought self, or our understanding about what qualities that we or other people believe we should or ought to possess. Since he was able to recognize how his friends weren't in a much better state after helping them, Hachiman carries his sense of duty to set things right. And the simple reason for why he wants to do so is because he cares about them. They're the only people that he can truly call his friend. Therefore, after damaging his relationship with Yui and Yukino and knowing that he truly cares for them, Hachiman wants to set things right. In the ensuing events, interestingly enough, Hachiman ends up satisfying both his ideal and ought self. His ideal self is one that does things alone and doesn't want to trust or believe in others. So, he ends up going behind Yui and Yukino's backs to fulfill Iroha's request for presidency, creating an elaborate scheme that functions off one huge lie. In this way, Hachiman's ought self is satisfied because the service club remains open and the trio can continue hanging out together. Despite all that has happened though, Hachiman still finds something wrong with this. In reality, Hachiman's ideal and odd self are in direct opposition with each other. His ideal self wants to be alone and doesn't want to trust others, but his odd self wants to be friends with Yui and Yukino. This internal conflict continues even further when Hachiman takes up Iroha's next request in private, going behind Yui and Yukino's backs once again, but believing that he's doing it for them. Hachiman has to let go of one or the other, which is a decision he ends up having to make sooner than expected.
けど、別にもう無理する必要なんてないじゃない。それで壊れてしまうのなら、それまでのものでしかない。違う？
Currently, Hachiman is experiencing an identity crisis, a critical time where an individual intensely evaluates their sense of self and where they belong in the world. What Yukino said really struck deep within Hachiman because it forced him to realize that he doesn't want to be separated from the service club. Before, Hachiman would be glad to not come to club and return back to his old life, but his relationship with Yui and Yukino literally changed his life. However, he couldn't admit that to himself, instead using Komachi to give him a purpose for mending his relationship with the two. It was all one big rationalization to uphold his ideal self. But now, after Yukino basically told him that he could return back to his old life, Hachiman doesn't want that anymore. Luckily for him, Hiratsuka-sensei is an important figure in his life as she always keeps him in check. From his cynical essays to her deathly punches, Hiratsuka-sensei has been there for Hachiman when no one else would. She most likely understands how Hachiman's personality came to be, but she doesn't forcefully change who he is and how he acts. If anything, her placement of Hachiman into the service club was a smart way for him to encounter many different life experiences, which also gives him the freedom on whether to integrate them into his identity. Essentially, Hiratsuka-sensei has played a massive role in shaping who Hachiman will later become. During their time on the bridge, Hiratsuka-sensei doesn't just guide Hachiman to action, but she also helps him to understand what kind of person he wants to become. Hachiman understood his ideal self so well, but the self that wants to continue being friends with Yui and Yukino is entirely new to him. And this is evidenced by how he doesn't understand why he wants to continue being friends with them.
大切なものだから傷つけたくない。
As any good mentor figure, Hiratsuka-sensei doesn't directly give Hachiman the answer he needs. She makes Hachiman get to the answer himself, forcing him to confront what he's been avoiding all this time, to face why he became a cynical and unsociable loner, to face why he engaged in all of his defense mechanisms, to face the fact that what he wanted all this time is what he's been most afraid of.
欲しいものがあったから。
私にはわからないわ。
As we know, the conclusion that Hachiman came to was that he wants something genuine. The trio has been acting superficially and putting on a facade with one another, and they've been tormenting themselves over it. But now that Hachiman knows he truly cares for Yui and Yukino, he wants their relationship to be authentic. No more facades, drop all pretenses, and be their true selves with one another. However, I believe there's a much more significant component to Hachiman's desire for genuineness. To me, it's a concept of vulnerability, the willingness to be open to uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure in social situations in spite of fears. In order to have an authentic relationship, then one also needs to take the risk of expressing their true selves, something that Hachiman has always been scared to do. Considering Hachiman's past experiences, it only taught him that being vulnerable leads to hurt and pain. And most definitely, Hachiman's fears are justified. When we allow ourselves to be completely open and vulnerable, we can be prone to worrying about negative evaluations or rejection, getting alienated by the other person, losing self-esteem and control over the situation, or giving the other person information that could be used against us. Hachiman truly understands the emotional costs that come with being who you genuinely are, which is why Hachiman has clung onto his cynical and loner self for so long, and it's also why his use of defense mechanisms is so extensive. It was also that Hachiman could avoid being vulnerable in order to not get hurt again.
言われても、多分俺はそれに納得できないと思う。なんか裏があるんじゃないかって、事情があってそう言ってるんじゃないかって、勝手に考えるかもしれない。
But Yui and Yukino are different. Little by little, Hachiman slowly learned that maybe these two are people he could be truly genuine with, that this time and place at the service club is one where he can be himself and confide in them. Obviously, he was never able to consciously admit that to himself, but it definitely showed in his actions and behaviors, and only required a small push from a certain mentor figure. Nonetheless, because he now knows that he cares for Yui and Yukino, because he now knows that the service club is precious to him, then Hachiman is willing to take that risk of being vulnerable, fully knowing that losing Yui, Yukino, and the service club is something he absolutely doesn't want.
俺は本物が欲しい。
あなたが好きよ、Hikigaya君。
In reality, just proclaiming your desire for something genuine simply isn't enough. You can't just be all talk. Your actions and behaviors actually have to align with what you're feeling. Not only that, but you should also be willing to express those emotions when possible. However, despite the desire for genuineness existing in the back of their minds, the trio ends up not actually fulfilling this wish.
それが引ヶ谷くんの言う本物？こういう時間が君の言う本物？
どうでしょうね。
Most definitely, being authentic and vulnerable with each other is something they all probably wanted. But there's just one unexpected development that got in the way of this: their romantic feelings. Although they were able to sort of bring this problem up with each other, they knew it wasn't going to be solved immediately. Other factors like Yukino needing to develop her own identity came into play, but a certain individual further complicated Hachiman's quest for genuineness.
正解はね、共依存っていうのよ。
In some ways, what Haruno said about the trio is actually correct. Erik Erikson believed that genuine intimacy requires a sense of identity to be firmly in place, or else the relationship becomes merely a tool to help resolve identity concerns for each partner. After all, both Yui and Yukino are their own individual person, and similar to Hachiman, they're sorting through their own identity concerns, dealing with their defense mechanisms, and processing how they want their own future to look like. Thus, according to Erik Erikson, one should have a well-developed identity before engaging in intimacy with romantic partners, else they'd run the risk of not developing their own individual self. Although Hachiman's proclamation for genuineness seemed to mark the beginning of a new identity, remnants of how he used to be still remain. He still engages in altruism, avoidance, rationalization, and all sorts of defense mechanisms. But what's different now is how he avoids confronting his romantic feelings, the inability to establish intimacy. Throughout Season 3, Hachiman wasn't just struggling to confess his feelings for Yukino, he was also struggling to admit that he had feelings for her. All of this happens despite his feelings for Yukino being traced all the way back to their first meeting. It was always clear that Hachiman had a much deeper connection with Yukino than anyone else in the series. Right when they met each other, although seemingly hostile, they were already bantering with each other and seemed to be somewhat okay with the other's presence. More so, they even shared memories of their past with each other, which weren't exactly good ones either, but actually served to further strengthen their friendship. As they continue spending more and more time with each other, you can see how their hostility fades away, and they actually begin looking out for each other, bonding and confiding in their similarities as fellow loners. However, what I found most compelling is how Hachiman was always wanting to help Yukino. Although Hachiman does help people, most of them were out of obligation for the service club or just simply not in his interest. To further this idea, let's compare this with Yui, Hachiman's other closest friend. In the times that Hachiman helps Yui, it never really seemed to be of his own choice. He helps her in baking Valentine's Day cookies, but that was a request to the service club. He tags along with her to the summer festival, but Komachi practically begged him to go and even gave him a practical reason for going. And the worst of it all, Hachiman simply grants Yui's wishes, only because that's what Yukino wanted. Hachiman does help Yui, but it never seems like it's of his own choice. In comparison to Yukino, Hachiman helping her out only seems to be what he wanted to do. If anything, the cultural festival back in Season 1 shows how Hachiman is rather protective of Yukino. Even with the given context of the relationship being a bit shaky, Hachiman still wants to help out Yukino's situation regarding Sagami, even actually relating to her.
だが、じゃあ一人でやることは悪いことなのか？どうして今まで一人でも頑張ってきていた人間が否定されなきゃいけないんだ？ そのことが俺は許せない。
And we obviously see this occur in season 3, where Hachiman wants to help out Yukino regarding the prom situation. Although it ends up with Hachiman declaring a battle against Yukino, as Iroha later quotes, was essentially just a cover-up confession.
けど、その責任も俺は取るべきだと思う。今までのやり方に問題があったなら、違うやり方とか、違う考え方、違う関わり方を探して、それでどういう結果になったとしても、その責任をちゃんと取りたい。だから、俺はお前を助けたいと思ってる。
こんなのほとんど告白だ。それか血は喧嘩か別れ話。
From the beginning, it was also very clear that Hachiman really did see and continued to see Yukino as a romantic interest. And as they built experiences and memories together, as they struggled with their emotions, as they endured not being able to be with each other, his feelings for Yukino only grew stronger. However, Hachiman ends up avoiding his feelings for Yukino for several different reasons. For one, Yukino was focused on developing her own identity, and confessing during this time would only lead to her downfall as an individual. Couple this with Hachiman being afraid to hurt Yui's feelings, and leading to the service club potentially breaking apart once again. However, it's the words of Haruno that really stops Hachiman in his tracks. Achieving genuineness has always been Hachiman's deepest desire, and once he believed that he finally obtained it, Haruno single-handedly messes everything up.
だから言ったじゃない。君は酔えない。
To be drunk is to be open and vulnerable, free from inhibitions and expressing your deepest feelings and desires. Conversely, to be sober can mean to be closed off, restraining yourself from expression and sticking to beliefs and ideals that you are socially bound by. Being sober is how Hachiman and Haruno have lived most of their lives, deceiving themselves about wanting to present their true selves due to fear of disapproval and rejection. Haruno can't get drunk because she's been deceiving herself for so long that her real self is probably unmemorable to her. If Hachiman continued on the path of a cynical and unsociable loner, then most likely he would become disillusioned with life as his past will continue to tie him down, never being able to truly live for himself in the present. If Hachiman continued with never confessing his feelings to the girl he liked from the very beginning, then most surely he would have ended up like Haruno as well.
私が20年もそうやって騙し騙しやってきたからよくわかる。そんな偽物みたいな人生を生きてきたの。
And once again, the mentor figure we know so well appears once again to save the day, Hiratsuka Sensei. Once again, she helps Hachiman in discovering who he truly wants to be and what he truly wants to do, which will ultimately be her last lesson to him before her departure as a teacher. Given that Haruno has spent the whole season complicating the interactions, feelings, and thoughts between our trio, Hiratsuka Sensei is easily able to set Hachiman right back on track. To put simply, with all the experiences that Hachiman has built up, with all the lessons and newfound knowledge he obtained, with the stars finally aligning, we receive the moment that we have been waiting for ever since this anime's conception.
お前は望んでないかもしれないけど、俺は関わり続けたいと思ってる。義務じゃなくて意志の問題だ。だから、お前の人生歪める権利を俺にくれ。
The two who were destined for each other from the beginning finally get together. Through their harsh years of being subjected to bullying, neglect, and rejection by their peers, to engaging in defense mechanisms to protect themselves from what they were scared of, from doing their best to figure out who they are and who they want to become, and deciding who they want to express their true selves with. Hachiman and Yukino were always going through the same issues and always looking out for each other, even when their relationship seemed to be in shambles. But despite that, they always pushed through and bettered themselves in order to lead up to the moment they always felt was right with each other.
あなたが好きよ、引きがやくん。
日の満ちるこの部屋、そっと